6 wheels, Tyrrell and Tamiya. I want to show you how I built this 120 scale kit, plus some cool little scratch built items to represent the P34 as it raced the 1977 Monaco Grand Prix by Patrick Depailler. We'll look at prepping all the parts, the painting and putting it all together. Stick around. G'day everyone and welcome back to the Wixie 500 YouTube channel. This build is actually quite a few years old now, from back in 2018, 2019. It's mostly out of box, but there are a few areas where I've added some easy made scratch built parts, such as support struts on the nose, brake bias cable in the cockpit and a few other bits and pieces. This is also my first time using the Alclad metallic finish paints. Unlike my more recent models, I didn't take as many photos of all the different stages of this build, but hopefully what's here is of interest and helpful for any of you who are looking to build this model. Comes moulded in blue, white, black and grey, plus a sprue here of plated parts. There's also a bag that contains the rubber tyres, and it's also got some tubing and some wiring here that are used for the spark plug leads. I started out just with some basic body prep and checking some fitment. So the cockpit, the front part of the cockpit is actually two halves that come together, and to get the spacing right at the back, Tamiya provide this little bar piece here to put in while the glue dries. But I decided, well, why use that? Just use the body that it's going to fit to, because there were locating holes in the body. So I just used that to get the spacing right. There's not a huge number of parts in this kit, so I did all of the cleanup at once. So all of these parts here have been sanded down, the mold lines have been removed, there's a bit of fill in a few places to take out some little dimples in the plastic. So basically everything here is ready for primer. A little tip that you might find handy if you've got a model that's got lots of suspension parts that are a little bit different from the left to right. What I do is I put all of the left-hand side parts into a Ziploc bag, and these are just the part numbers of what's in the bag, so that they can't be mixed up with the right hand side parts. So it just makes it easier when it comes time to do the assembly. Now, all of the parts from the 1976 version of the kit are still in this 1977 build, so these are the bits that don't get used. So the earlier edition has got different shape cockpit and seat insert, the wing end plates were different roll bar and a few other bits and pieces, so these parts just don't get used in the 1977 build. The rear brake scoops are solid pieces of plastic, so I got the drill out and drilled into the face of where the opening would be, and then used a hobby knife to carve out a bit more of a realistic hole for the air to go in compared to the solid piece that comes with the kit. This is just the assembly of the engine block and the rear bulkhead on the tub, and they've both been hit with Tamiya flat aluminium, which looks a bit bland straight out of the airbrush, but at the time I was at this part of the build, I had never used or seen the Alclad product. I was yet to discover that, so I was just initially going to be using the Tamiya metallic paints. This is the engine with the cam covers on, and the ignition wires are fitted into the part of the ignition in the V of the engine, but they get fitted up into their holes a little later on. And also this has had a bit of a wash over it just to bring out some of the detail in the casting and the oil pumps and so on the side here. This is the trans axle and gearbox in partial assembly. The P34 had inboard rear brakes, which was reasonably common at the time. Race cars have had outboard brakes for a long time since, but that was sort of standard fare at the time. This is just a number of the parts coming together. Now, you might notice the bulkhead here, it's got oil tank and a few other pieces on, and the P34 actually had a triangulated monocoque, a little bit like the Brabham BT44. So the bulkhead here, the instructions call for this to be painted in an aluminium colour, but I've just painted it black just to simulate the hole that would have been in the side there. And you can see here ignition wires and the back of the gearbox and a few other bits and pieces ready to start coming together. Now with the body, I used Tamiya's white primer on the white parts and grey primer on everything else, just to give it a bit of a hit, and then sand it down to see where any flaws are and any dips and things that needed to be fixed. For some reason, the cockpit surround no longer sat flat. The spacing across the back was fine, so it's not an issue from what I did earlier, but you can see here there's a bit of a gap at the bottom. It's sort of rocking as if something had twisted. This is a batch of parts ready to be hit with some black paint, and a little bit of a tip for if you've got lots of parts that are similar shape like these. There's 8 different exhaust headers here, and they're all different. So the numbers in the foam indicate the part number. So I paint a particular part, just put it back to the part number, and that way you don't get them mixed up. So you know exactly which part you're dealing with when it comes time for assembly. I then gave the body another light coat of primer, and I masked off the cockpit here because by this time I had discovered now the L-clad and wanted to try out the polished aluminium on the interior. So I didn't want to get too many coats of paint, so I masked that off so that the primer didn't go down in there, because I needed to paint that black as a base for the L-clad a little later on. I used Tamiya's TS15 blue, decanted and run through the airbrush. So this is after the initial coat dried a bit dull, and so I hit it with a second coat, come up a bit better, but still wasn't totally happy with it. And this is after the masking has come out. So I had considered stripping and starting the blue again, but after using some polishing compounds on it, sort of saved the finish a little bit. So I thought, well, the thing's going to get a clear coat over the top of the decals anyway. I'll just keep pressing on with what I was doing. This is the engine and gearbox assembly with most of the parts in. There's still no fuel injection on the top of it, and the suspension to go from the uprights to the bulkhead gets fitted when this goes onto the car. But overall, this isn't looking too bad, and this is just the same assembly from the rear. It's then time to move on to the decal application, and Tamiya's decals go down well, nice finish on them, and no problems getting them to adhere. The white here is 2 parts, so the word national and the word travellers here are going over a break in the bodywork. So once they had been applied and settled down and had mostly dried, I just used a sharp hobby knife to run through here to separate them so the body parts could come apart, and then just use some decal softener to make the edges of the decal conform properly and make a nice neat edge. One thing though that I find is a little bit of a problem, I use the Mr. Mark setter to help the decal adhere to the body, but when I use it on models with a dark color like this blue of this Tyrrell, you see here around this little number 4, there's like a little stain, and it's the setter compound. So I don't know why that happens. I can't get it off. It's just in there permanently. So I'm not sure if anyone else has that happen. This masking here is just for the fire extinguisher. I didn't want any black or the metallic finish to get on that, because that'll get painted red afterwards. Once I've got all the decals on, I let them properly dry for several days before I start hitting it with any clear coat. The clear on all the body parts on this one is Tamiya's TS13 run through the airbrush, and once it's hardened, it's time to polish it up. And this rear wing main element would be the highlight of the bodywork on this model. Come out really, really well, and you really can't tell where the decal finishes and where the paint starts with this one. It was then time to mask the bodywork so that I could spray the inside of the cockpit with the gloss black, to then be followed by the L-clad polished aluminium, or aluminum as the colour on the side of the bottle says. This blue is a low tack tape, but even so, I put some paper over the top of where the decals were, just to prevent any chance of the tape lifting the decal, because I've had that happen in the past, and it's a pain. Also, underneath part of the model needs to get the black and the aluminium colour. And this is after some gloss black has been applied onto the body. Ideally, you should try and polish this black to get a nice shiny finish for the metallic colour to go over. But a little bit difficult polishing under here, and a lot of this is going to be difficult to see anyway in the final assembly. I've taken the masking off, and I was a bit disappointed actually with the finish of the L-clad, because it had sort of this weird frosting texture on it, and a matte finish. But I've since learned that that's probably due to me putting it on a little bit heavy. It's apparently supposed to just go on very, very lightly. But I did notice that if you buff it, takes the frosting off. You can see here around the edges is sort of a frosting on it, but up here it's not. So yeah, buff it up and it comes up quite okay. I had planned to spray the L-clad 24 hours after the gloss black, but due to work commitments and life getting in the way, meant that the tape was on the model for a number of weeks, and that was a problem when I went to take the tape off, because while it didn't touch the decals because of the paper that I put over the top of them, parts of the tape had come off and adhered to the model, and there was a lot of glue residue in places as well. You can see here this looks all very bad. It's glue residue that I then had to clean and polish off the body. This is the aluminium color after the residue had been polished off, and the finish is not too bad, but ended up with some spatter patterns coming up through here. Now I don't know whether that's because of something with the airbrush has gone through and hit it, or whether there was some contamination on the part to begin with. Not really sure. Not a big issue here because the seat will cover most of this. The L-clad polished aluminum was also used on the chassis sections of the front suspension assembly. So the suspension arms are masked off here because I don't want those getting metallic color, and then it's been sprayed with the L-clad. And then with the masking off, this is how the parts come up. Now there's still a little bit of touch up to do. There's a slight bleed through here on some of the metallic color come through, but they ended up cleaning up really well. The model uses a metal screw to attach the engine to the floor, which has also got the L-clad on the part of the floor here, which is why it's got that sort of a more shiny finish. It's a bit of a tough job getting the engine lined up and all four of these trailing arms all lined up at the same time, but once you get them in there, the screw is the thing that provides the strength. Now this blue area here, from what I read, that's a compartment that Tamiya built into this model to hold batteries in the event that the model would be motorized, and this is just the same assembly looking at it from the other end. These hoses here will get attached to the radiators once the top body goes on. The front suspension sub-assemblies are fiddly and frustrating. This one here is complete. It's got the air duct into the front lot. This is the right-hand side of the car, so this is the front set of front wheels and the rear set of front wheels, if you like, with the ducting in place. But they start off with an upper and a lower part that come together and sandwich the spring and shock absorber assemblies in between. And it's quite fiddly to get all of that to line up and when you're trying to get it all glued together. But it all come together quite well in the end. And these are the two main parts of the car ready to come together. The final finish on the main body is not too bad, but it's not as good as what was on the rear wing. I could have possibly polished it more, but after having to use some polish to get rid of the residue we were talking about before, I was a bit scared of cutting through the clear and hitting the decals, so I thought, it doesn't look too bad. We'll just leave it as it is. And when you get to this stage, when the engine and the main chassis is together, always a significant step in an F1 build, indicates you're getting somewhere, although there's still a lot to go on this one. With the seat, this had white primer followed by white gloss. I used Tamiya's TS26. Then the decals went down and clear over the top. So then it's time to mask off the part that stays white and hit this with the same color as the rest of the car, which is the TS15 Tamiya. This build was also the first time I'd added further wiring detail to a model. I just used pieces of scrap wire that were laying around at home and pulled out some copper strands from within those. And see here with the copper strand, I just used super glue or CA glue to attach it to the back of some of the switch panels. This black wire here is to represent the brake bias cable, so it just glues in the back of where the brake bias knob is, and that will end up running down into the footwell of the car once this is assembled. I also put thin wires into the back of each of the gauges on the dashboard, so one wire per gauge. I decided to mask and spray the front splitter blade rather than hand paint it, so I used tape and a freezer bag to seal the rest of the body from getting any overspray on it. Then a quick run of semi-gloss black through the airbrush did the job nice and quick. And then immediately remove the masking and can see here it's come up quite well. There were no bleeds at all, so I was happy with that. The clear plastic sheet that is provided in the kit for the cockpit windows is flat, whereas the aperture that it has to fit is curved, and that's a bit of a problem. And also the instructions in the sheet for cutting these pieces up is incorrect. So after carefully trimming these, I used some side cutters here as a bit of a weight to hold the clear piece in place while the glue dried. The semi-gloss black on the inside here is just hand brushed in. The wheels, tyres and rear wing are all magically done and ready to fit. kit, but in reality I just forgot to take the photos. The tyres in this kit are the same as those in the original 1976 version, where the Goodyear logos on both the rear and the front is actually moulded into the tyre and with a raised edge, and you paint that by hand with some flat white, which is what I did here. So you could improve this by sanding those markings off and maybe using decals or mask sprays, but I didn't have anything suitable, so I just hand painted it and went with how the kit was originally intended. The wheels are an easy press fit, so they just push onto the axles, but they're fairly wobbly when you put them on, so when you display the model, there's a little bit of play. You can move them around to adjust them to get them to look right. Fitting this front anti-roll bar presented a problem because the steering column got in the way, so I don't know whether that's a mistake with the kit, because this is an extra part in the 77 version. It's different to the previous version of the kit, or whether it's some mistake I've made with the assembly. But either way, what I did is I just cut the bottom of the steering column off and refitted it at a little bit of an angle to clear the roll bar. So you wouldn't have known that was different if I didn't tell you, but yeah, it's not as it comes. Then once the bar was in place, I was able to then fit these links that connected to the suspension, and that's a bit of a fiddly job, so I got them sitting there as a dry fit and then just dropped a dab of CA glue on them to hold them in place. Tamiya's 120 scale kit does not include the 5 little support struts that go out to the front splitter. The 112 kit does include them, but this one doesn't. So what I did was cut some plastic up, stuck it on some tape here. I then painted it with a mix of semi-gloss black and gunmetal, and then just used some super glue to drop them into place on the front of the model. And you can see here, this is how they come up, and I think it really adds to the accuracy of this model. So yeah, there it is, the 77 Monaco Grand Prix version of the P34 six-wheeler with the box art in the background. The model can be displayed with the bodywork on, or with the cockpit surround removed, and even with the seat insert removed. And I guess you could take the wheels off to provide another option as well. A further addition I made was this small black hose to the oil cooler using a piece of black wire. It's often tricky to assemble rear wings on these cars because there's multiple pieces have to come together and be glued all at one time. It's really easy to mess up, but this one come out nice and square and clean. This is the other side, and the rain light here is just hand painted. There's no transparent lens provided in this kit. Good old 3-pedal arrangement in these old Formula 1 cars. This is the cockpit detail from the driver's side. So this is the brake bias knob we were talking about before, and the cabling that runs down to the brake pedal. The gauges are decals. The Ford Cosworth DFV V8 engine powered most of the Formula 1 field in the 1970s. This kit included the plug lead, but not the high tension lead from the coil, which is this yellow one that I've added in afterwards, just off a scrap offcut. Now, the kit's fuel injection trumpets were supplied chrome plated, but in real life they're actually aluminium. So I use a little bit of bathroom mold remover, easily strips the chrome off the parts, and then I just painted these in an aluminium color to get a more realistic effect. I used a black marker for the window edges, which was done before the clear perspex windows were fitted in from behind. And the finish on this piece is pretty good. I used several coats of clear, and then it's been wet sanded and polished up. And again, like the rear wing element, it's very difficult to see where the decal film is on this. So I was pretty happy with that. An area that Tamiya could improve this kit is the seat belts. This version includes decals for the seat belts, which is better than the original kit because that didn't have any belts at all in it. So I guess there's one step up, but it's an area that could be greatly improved with some aftermarket belts and buckles. I was a bit shaky on the hand lettering. It's very fiddly, and again, this area of the model could easily be improved with some of the more modern solutions with decals or mask sprays, but at the time I didn't have anything that was suitable, and this is just a mixture of some silver and some colour to get this sort of anodized effect on part of the wheel securing system. This is the other side of the cockpit, just showing some of the wires that were added, just livens up the detail a little bit when you're displaying the model without the bodywork on it. So yeah, that's it. There are a few more photos coming up, but that's it as far as any build advice goes. I'm not sure when I'll get the next video up, but if you want to know when it drops, you might as well subscribe and hit the notification bell, so at least you'll be advised of when that happens, and then you can decide whether you want to watch it or not. Feel welcome to comment below, like it or dislike it, but until next time, cheers.